We're live.
Okay, this is the Senate Education Committee in the afternoon of April 7th. We're doing a few things today, but we're starting with some analysis by the Joint Fiscal Office. Part of it, the first half, if you will, is Julia Richter and really doing a bit of a refresh for the committee about where we are, finances work, and what the financial gaps or issues are that we're trying to address with this, and just really kind of we might have seen most of this, but not all of it before exactly the same way. But a bit of a reset, a reminder of why we're doing what we're doing. And then, as you know, that in the back of the end of the bill, we put in really as a placeholder for committee discussion, raising the base on the education spending increase we've had for the last couple of years. And Ezra Klein will be up after Julia has done an analysis about the impacts of that. So we have 2 hours set aside. We may not need the whole thing. I've never heard anybody say about a break if we have one. Start with Julia. You have a hard stop at.
I have a hard stop when the committee is done with my portion. Portion.
Okay. Oh, you don't have a hard stop after.
I have a soft. I have a soft stop at 2,
okay. Right.
And I'm booked into House Ways and Means all day, every day this week, and they understand that I'm here.
Okay.
So
Soft stop.
Well, good.
soft stop. Yeah.
So I went through this these presentations with Julia and Ezra yesterday. It's just I think they wanted to test clarity on me, and I thought it was clear. So off we go.
Great, thank you. I'm Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. There is a slide deck posted on the committee page under my name. I see you have it printed out in front of you as well. Would you like me to go ahead and share the slides?
Maybe only for people watching.
Sure.
Have the hard copies.
Yeah, so as the chair mentioned, he asked us to put together some charts and graphs really outlining how the education fund has changed over time and education fund costs in the state of Vermont. I would say most, if not all, its analysis we have done at some point in time in the last few years, but some of it we did need to update for these slides pilot all here. You all know that we're nonpartisan, unbiased, providing information for legislative consideration. So, sort of 4 topics that we thought to talk through today. One is how education fund costs and revenues have changed over time and what that means looking forward. 2, again, how education fund costs have changed over time in relation to pupil changes. 3, how pupil spending varied across the state of Vermont in FY 2026. And lastly, student to staff ratios in Vermont. So just sort of level setting, I think this is a helpful graph because it talks about, when we're talking about education funding, we're talking about the largest area of unduplicated state funds. So what we're looking at here is the appropriations by area of government in fiscal year 2026. There's 2 colors on this slide. This blue bottom bar refers to federal funds, and the gray top bar refers to state funds. I put a green circle here around K through 12 education. So when we're talking about state education funds, we're talking about $2.5 billion each year.
And the difference between the 2.9 and the 2.5 you're talking about is the blue at the bottom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as you can see, the vast bulk of funding for education in the state comes from the state education fund. Of course, Vermont has a education finance team that's different than other states, where all of our education, local and state education funds are all coming from the state level. We have no local funds, it's all state monies. So looking at how those costs and revenues have changed over time, this first chart is showing the total uses of the education fund going back to fiscal year 2009. None of the numbers in the slide deck have been adjusted for inflation. And what we're seeing here is really how they have increased over time. Total uses generally refers to the total appropriations out of the education fund. So how much money is flowing out of the ed fund? We can see in 2009, it was below 1.5 billion. And now we're a little over 2.5 billion projected in FY 2027.
Is that line accurate? Because I know around 2019 it went up because of COVID, didn't it?
So interesting question. So what we're looking at, I will say, yes, the line is accurate. I think that perhaps what you're talking about that this graph is not capturing is the total funding for education in the state of Vermont. So here we're looking at solely the state
Okay,
education fund dollars. To your point, during the COVID pandemic, there was a slew of federal funds that came into the state, those ESSER dollars, and that's where we really saw that increase in education funding that has since sort of tapered off at the federal level. This is showing, in addition to federal monies, how much has the state kicked in.
so did we have to do like a state match to that federal funding to get that increase in the line?
For the COVID dollars, no, I don't. I would need to come back and talk about all of the monies.
So if we had an expenditure line, it would be different, but
Yes,
yeah, it would be higher.
and if we had
Yeah.
all money going to school districts, it would be different. This is capturing, and this whole slide deck is only looking at funds coming out of the statewide education fund. And I also want to flag too, it's important to note, what does the education fund capture? I don't have it in these slides because we're talking about it. You'll recall that there's a number of policy decisions that have been made over time as to what is included within the education fund. In addition to the state share of school budgets, we also have all of those categorical aid programs, so special education, transportation reimbursement, career and tech ed, universal school meals, flexible pathways, and on. You also have the other appropriations out of the education fund, like the normal cost of teachers' pensions and OPEB. And so that also is included in these total uses of the ed fund.
So I think that I may be mistaken, but doesn't the governor's budget say what, 2.1 billion for education funding? That's all state money?
I don't remember off the top of my head the numbers that are in the GovRec budget. What I'm guessing, or what perhaps you might be talking about, is the education payment,
Right.
and that we're talking about. I have in a few slides. There's a whole lot of different ways to talk about education funding in the state. Education spending is a technical term, and I know we talked about this months ago, but as a refresher, education spending is the school district's total budget minus its offsetting revenue. So everything it's getting from the federal government, the categorical aid it's getting from the state education fund, if it's pulling money from local reserves, if another school district is paying tuition, we subtract all of that out. And then whatever's left is what that school district needs to have from the education fund, and that's their education spending. And when we sum up all of the education spending, that's called the ed payment. And so that would be closer to the number that you're referencing.
Because that line at the end shows pretty close to what I think is what you call this year. Okay.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that it took 15 years to go up by what, 700 million to get to the 2000, and then only 5 years to go another almost the same distance, right? Second, yeah.
I think too, that's that raises an important point, which I think is often lost when talking about solely the percentage change year over year of any sort of funding level or cost. The larger the base against which a percentage is applied, of course, the larger the increase. So when thinking about an increase or a percentage change of year over year, we need to think about the base at which that increase of percentage is being applied against. So this is how all of the uses, the appropriations out of the ed fund have grown over time. What we have next is non-property tax revenues and how they are projected to grow into the future and looking at the past as well. So you'll recall that the education fund has a number of non-property tax revenue sources: sales and use, meals and rooms, purchase and use, lottery. And the way that property tax amounts are determined are by taking the total education fund uses, what we just looked at, subtracting what we're getting from non-property tax revenues, and everything else needs to be made up by something. And absent another policy choice, that's made up by property tax revenues. So what we see here is that while non-property tax revenues were growing really strongly in 22 and 23 at almost 9 and then 8%, they're tapering off to growth between 2 and 3% in the coming years.
That's just the growth in those sources of revenue, not how they compare to the property tax.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So this little yellow box that I put around each of these is how the total education fund non-property tax revenues are estimated to grow
Okay.
compared to the prior year.
Did we anticipate this in any way with 2022?
I can zoom in a little bit.
Did we forecast this because people, like, what would you say explains a sharp drop off in 2024?
So I think the state economist would be best suited to speak to
That's fair.
that. I would say that for context, we're looking at the tail end of the pandemic where there
Yeah.
was all of that stimulus money coming in.
Okay, right.
And so I
Thank you.
think it's a
Yeah.
question of, is it a steep decline or is
Right.
it more leveling out to what it was pre-pandemic?
Right. Like, it's so interesting because in 2025, the lottery just took a nosedive and then went back up a little. They all have stories to tell about, like, why, what Vermonters are investing in or feel.
Absolutely. And I will also say too, this is, I think, one of the things that you're getting at in terms of all of these differences and changes. When we look at the individual differences, the smaller the revenue source, the
Yeah.
smaller the amount of change is needed to see a
Mhm.
big swing percentage wise.
Senator Rushing.
Thank you. Could you just tell me how much, what the percentage is from each of these funds that goes to education?
Sure. So all of sales and use tax goes to education. And I will say, and I can send this to Daphne when I'm done. Whenever I was in here last, running the education fund outlook that has all of the sources. And so that'll show you that over time, but I can send it again.
Thank you.
So all of sales and use tax, 1/3 of purchase and use tax, and this is in current law, 1/4 of meals and rooms, all of the lottery transfer. Medicaid is weedy. That's with respect to the money coming back after the school-based Medicaid program. So it's dedicated to the education fund, but there's a split where some of it is going back directly to school districts, some of it's through the ed fund. And then there's other sources.
Thank you.
In a transportation fund or
Well, we could actually even pull that up. They have Hotland here at the bottom, the revenue forecast. So this is a really, if you haven't spent time in it and you're interested, I would really recommend it. It's a super interesting document. There's a lot of narrative up front. This is prepared by the state legislative economist. But avert your eyes, way down at the bottom is where you will be able to find all of the revenue forecasts. And this is that revenue forecast process that's done every year in January and July and adopted by the board. So here you can see the available education fund revenue. It's available because the ed fund doesn't get, as we just spoke about, all meals and rooms. So this is automatically divvying it up for you. And then here, Senator Hashim on page 49 of the revenue forecast is where you can see the transportation revenues. You really want to be looking at available because this is incorporating those splits.
Any cannabis tax in education?
No, I think that the cannabis tax that you're talking about is, that's dedicated to the after school, special fund.
So all that tax goes to after school?
Yeah, that 13 billion, 10 to 13.
Well, there's a few different cannabis taxes. Where they're all dedicated, I don't know. I would need to, phone my colleague Ted, unless any of my JFO colleagues know.
It's a fiscal issue, isn't there a cannabis?
Oh, maybe. We can follow up with resources about cannabis.
So I think that perhaps the takeaway from this is that these splitter taxes that make up the other part of the ed fund are increasing at a rate lower than the rate of increase in the ed fund, which means that much more pressure on property taxes. That's my take on it.
Absolutely. And that's what we see in the next slide.
Okay.
Is what we see here in the next slide are those two metrics that we just spoke about overlaid with each other. So this top line, this blue line is showing us those education fund uses that we already looked at, how much money needs to come out of the statewide ed fund each year. And this bottom line, this orange line is showing the projected total non-property tax revenues. So because property taxes need to make up that difference, like we just spoke about, or another revenue stream, one-time general fund money works too. But something needs to cover the difference. And that something is that need is growing each year. This only goes back to 2018 because there was a change in revenue streams in 2018. And so this is our way to do apples to apples. I thought that someone was going to ask the numbers associated with each of these green bars. And if you had asked that, I was going to be ready to show you. So that's what we see on slide 9. This is the same chart that we just looked at, except now with numbers. So what we're seeing here is the total uses, again, going from 1.6 billion up to a little over 2.5 billion. And then the share that's being made up by by our non-property tax revenues, and then our property taxes or one-time general fund. So you see the increase of the need for property tax revenues going from 1.07 billion in FY 2018 to 1.7 billion in FY 27. And this is why property taxes are going up.
Is it possible to go back to 2008 at some point to 2018 to see if we had almost the same, any type of it? Because you went back how far?
To 2009.
Yeah, just to see if we're way out of sorts, and then we got to figure out why it's gone short healthcare and all that again.
So I would say it is possible. And
It's fairly easy because if it's not,
and we've already done that.
Okay.
We have this split of revenues prior to FY 2018. The challenge is that in FY 2018 there was an act that I don't remember the number of that was passed that changed the way the education fund is funded. So prior to FY 2018 there was the general fund transfer, and it didn't have all of these other the same amount of non-property tax revenues dedicated to the ed fund. So we could go back and say, here's how much money was coming into the ed fund before property taxes and show that. But looking at the split, it's challenging because there was that big transfer.
no worries.
But I do have slides that I actually already put together about this in the last year or two, so I can send those to Daphne for you to take a look. And I would say there's two questions as to why has this happened, to your point. There's the more fiscal piece that I can answer, and then there's the narrative piece that I can't. The fiscal piece is that, as we just looked about, non-property tax revenues are generally growing at a pace closer to 3%. and ed fund uses are growing more than that. Which means that in the money committees, it's often talked about as the alligator chart, you know, the mouth opening. Those lines just continue to get further and further apart. Why ed fund uses are growing at the pace that they're growing at is a better question for the field and agency. So that's that's usage and revenues over time. Now looking at ed fund costs and pupils over time. So this is that chart I was referencing to your question, Senator Williams, showing the ed fund uses and education payment. So again, this blue line is the same one we've already looked at however many times. The line below that, the green line, this is the education payment. So that's the sum of all of the education spending, which is of course the school budgets minus offsetting revenues. But you can see that they're both generally moving in a similar direction. And the difference between the two is reflecting other uses, other costs out of the education fund beyond the education payment. So that difference is capturing all the categorical aid, the pensions, any one-time appropriations.
But not things that we put in as a separate line item.
The difference is the what you're putting in as a line item. So the total uses of the ed fund,
I thought we were up toward like 3 billion.
a little over 2.5 billion for the amount coming out of the statewide education fund. We're closer to 3 billion when you're looking at all of the education dollars unduplicated out of the budget, but that includes federal.
Got it. Okay. Helpful.
So this is how costs have been rising in the education fund. This is how pupils have been declining in the state. I want to note this axis is not to zero. What we're looking at here is what we generally use to measure the count of students, which is long-term average student membership. Essentially, on average, how many kids, butts and seats are there? And we can see that the pupil count has been declining generally since 2009. And we're closer to when it was closer to 95,000 and now we're closer to 80,000. So when we overlay those two graphs, which is what we're doing here, again, we can see those costs over time corresponding with our left-hand axis and the decline in pupils corresponding with our right-hand axis. And so if you think about, you know, people talking about how the cost per pupil is going up, it's a function of the two. We have fewer pupils, and we have increasing costs.
Okay. Okay. This is not adjusted for inflation.
Correct. None of the dollars in this slide deck are adjusted for inflation.
Has anyone asked you to do it adjusted for inflation? Like healthcare looks way over, you know, like that. Even when you adjust for inflation, that's a huge number. I wouldn't think education is as dramatic when you adjust for inflation.
Yeah, so I have done similar charts. Not this year. I can send them along, or I can come back with these charts adjusted for inflation, showing that. One of the questions is the appropriate inflation index to use. And the other point too that I would say is, even if adjusting for inflation were to make those so that units, are completely flat over time, because we have a decline in student count, we would still see an increase in the per pupil cost. Because if you're holding the cost constant, but you're dividing by a smaller and smaller number, just naturally the per pupil cost will rise. So that's really in part what this is showing, is that when talking about increases in the cost of education, when looking at it at the per pupil level, it's not just talking about the fact that costs are going up, it's talking about the fact that pupils are going down.
Right, costs are so big. I mean, I wonder if there's a way to, like, how do you look at this data to make sure you're getting the full picture of what's happening? I'm not saying that, like, where are those fixed overhead resources? I mean, in a way, it's like, how do you tell the story that we have too many buildings and that those fixed costs maybe are like continuing to eat up resources as the per pupil amount goes down, not like we have to pay people more, we have to pay for healthcare, et cetera. But like, is there a way to pull out our overall spend on facilities and say, like, we can't keep spending this much on facilities while this number is going down?
I think that's an excellent and hard question. I would say, can certain types of costs be pulled out? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Assuming that they have been appropriately coded
right,
in the expenditure data.
right.
We really only have the uniform chart of accounts going back to 2020. The other piece of it too is, or a couple of thoughts. One is that, what is a fixed cost in the education space? 70 to 80% of costs are personnel.
Mm-hmm.
I do not know
Mm-hmm.
what the appropriate staffing levels are
Mm-hmm.
in schools.
Right.
And in the education space. With respect to facilities, absolutely, facilities are included here. They're not the large share of
Right.
this, and then one of the questions too is with the school facilities that we have, as we know, school construction, the studies have identified a significant need, as you all know better than I do, in terms of what is projected to be
Right.
needed. So there's like that difference of like, should more be spent on facilities?
Right. No, and if you'll bear with me, like, it was whenever we were able to say, hey, healthcare costs are going like this, but ER costs and prescription drug costs are going like this, and that's contributing to this. Like, how do we take whatever is coded to say, like, this part needs to come down? I mean, and I just say that because I think Vermonters are asking us to look first at facilities and administrative costs. You know, they get upset when they feel like the budget could be cut, but they don't want to lose their favorite teachers or whatever. So how can we start to look at charts that show us, like, you know, which codes are driving where? Yeah, like how do we just visualize?
That would be a great question for the agency.
Okay.
They a couple of years ago, I believe it was Nicole Lee, who used to be the director of education and finance,
Yeah.
did a deep dive into all of the cost drivers, and did a survey with the school business managers trying to identify some of those cost drivers related to the points that you're raising: health insurance, facilities. Another one I looked into was mental health.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to, I honestly just don't know. I don't remember, if the agency has presented that this year. But that would be a good question for them.
Okay. Do you know who, like, can I email somebody?
We'll do
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, you're trying to identify the drivers within those costs, and you know, it's. Yeah. It's administration.
Personnel.
Personnel,
Yeah.
personnel is really where it is.
Right.
It's really personnel, and then within personnel. We're doing it.
Right. And if they tell us, oh, we're not coding this all correctly, that's also instructive because it makes it really hard to tell what savings we plan to achieve or whatever if it's coded badly or inconsistent.
Yeah, the right sense is the one, the savings are going to come from the efficient expenditure of monies of personnel.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I hear you, but it's like, then we could look at policies like different ratios and say, okay, this will have more of a financial savings than cutting the number of school buildings down by 25%. You know, if we're doing rough math.
Okay, so pivoting from looking at just the statewide costs. Actually, before pivoting, I guess I would say one more thing, which is really saying to this conversation's point, what this is capturing is the total amount of money coming out of the education fund. It's not talking at all about where it's going or how it's being used or what policy decisions are or are not impacting that money, be it at the federal, state, or local level. It's solely talking about what's coming out of the ed fund. So now moving on to how per pupil spending is varying across the state. So a reminder that per pupil spending is actually a technical term in statute. It's the education spending divided by the weighted pupil count. So again, the weighted pupil count is the total number of students in the state plus their reading categories. Excuse me, and in FY26, this is 142,564. So that's in comparison to the total number of kids, which is closer to 82,000. Education spending, we've talked about this as well. School district's total budget minus its offsetting revenues. This was about $2 billion in fiscal year 2026. And because it's essentially a fraction, right? It's the education spending divided by the weighted pupil count. Because there are those two pieces, higher or lower weighted per pupil spending could be a function of increased education spending, lower weighted pupils, or some combination of the two.
So, just make sure, going back to the earlier slides. We said 2 billion here, and the slide number showed 2.5. Difference is
Two things. One, this 1.99 billion is referring to this green bar, the education payment, rather than the total uses, which is this blue.
Which includes the retirement.
Which includes retirement and all of your categorical aid.
So that's what brings us up there. Yeah.
So the retirement, the pensions and OPEB in FY26 together is about 60 million.
60.
60 coming out of the education fund.
Okay.
so you said we includes retirement and said two things.
So the 60 million, that's the
No, the difference between the 2 million or 2.5, you said.
Oh,
includes
and-
Environment and.
categorical aid.
category. Okay,
So that's special education, state placed students, transportation, tech ed, small school support.
got it.
So that's the primary difference. The other difference is here, these charts are capturing FY27. That's our rightmost data point. When looking at the distribution of per weighted pupil spending, we're looking at FY26 because we already have all of the final data for that. And the FY27 is still projections.
Yep.
So that's how we're calculating per weighted pupil spending. What is the range? Well, the December 1 letter is required to report on the range of per weighted pupil spending. So this is a quote from the December 1 letter that in FY26, the range of per weighted pupil spending among districts that operate at least one school is 10,846 to 19,090. Couple of caveats with that range. One is that's among districts that operate at least one school. So that's not capturing those districts that do not operate any schools. And two, that includes adjustments for excess spending. So you'll recall that if districts are above the excess spending threshold, then the amount they're above the excess spending threshold is double counted. So that adjustment is included here. So a lot of words, a lot of numbers. What does it actually look like? That's what we see here on slide 17. Slide 17, each one of these little dots is a school district. This is in FY26, and this is showing you the range of per weighted pupil spending. So what we can see here is the school district that was spending the least amount per weighted pupil is this far left school district, spending around 9,000 per weighted pupil. And the school district that was spending the most per weighted pupil was sitting right above 18,000.
You know, which district that was? No.
I would need a follow-up.
Okay.
I will say that it's the agency does have a great resource where they publish all of the per pupil spending
I
data.
think so you just said between basically $11,000 and $19,000 is and that's total weighted of the student, correct? Of the need of the student.
So that's to rephrase. I'm going to rephrase what I think is the answer to your question, and you're going to tell me if I answered your question. That's capturing the per weighted student, the amount of dollars per weighted student. So say that I was a student who was learning English as a second language, and I was from an economically disadvantaged background. I would count as 1 just for being me, plus 1 point whatever for being economically disadvantaged, plus 2.49 for being an English learner. So together, I would count as like 5 for so weighted pupils. That's what's done for every single student. And then we take the education spending and we divide by all of those weighted students.
What gets me is we've got $19,000 in our actual spending on students we give out is at $24,000. So where's that other $6,000? Is that special needs? Is that why? Because if we were at $20,000,
So
have the increases that we have.
So I think that what you're getting at is the difference of if you were to look at it not by weighted student, but if you were to look at it just by student, regardless of additional needs or circumstances or additional weights. So the other way to think about it is here we're looking at per weighted pupil spending. So that's incorporating the additional needs that are included in law for these different circumstances. If you wanted to know literally per body in school, regardless of circumstance, how much would it be? You would take the total education spending, and instead of dividing it by the 142,000 of weighted students, you would divide it by the 82,000 number of kids.
And that's how we come out to basically $24,000 a student. But when we look at this number, it's only 20,000.
So it's, yeah, I guess I would say it's,
It just,
Yeah, same dollars of more students.
yeah, we're a foundation formula. Basically, we're saying $16,000, but we're basically $6,000 short per child on our current spending. So it's like this. I'm lost of where that other $5,000 to $6,000 is on the 19,000 when you broke this down. And these are the numbers for 2020, 25, 26. And we're way over that per student.
so I think that the big difference is this is capturing all of those weights.
Yes,
And what you're talking about is, and I honestly haven't done the calculation, so I don't know if it's 24,000. Assuming that it is, that difference is, the fact that these numbers appear lower because it's a larger student count that it's being divided by, which are those weights.
Do you understand where I'm going?
Yeah.
That we get these numbers, but when we do the math, we're at $24,000 a student, and it's like, where's that extra money going?
Are
Why?
you talking about the foundation formula?
No, not just the foundation formula right now. We got 82,000 students divided into the 2 whatever billion. Let's do quick math.
So,
And I'm just, you just,
Trying to make common sense.
I'm just, where is that other money?
We just have to always make sure we're comparing apples to apples. Because this is weighted student, showing the weighted, yeah.
This is weighted student and it has the high and low, and at the high end, we're still at $20,000, yet we spend. And I'm trying to figure out where that extra money goes.
It's for accounting is 5 rather than 1.
But I thought this takes,
I guess I would say, I guess I would take a little bit of a step back.
I am,
But I would
that's
say-
why I'm asking these questions.
A few things. One, I would say that, what we're looking at here is literally a direct quote from the Department of Taxes about the weighted student count. So I wouldn't say it's mine. I would say it's the Department of Taxes. And then the other thing that I would say is, to your point, there are different metrics that we can look at. And so this is one metric, and this is why we really want to make it very clear, we're talking about per weighted pupil spending. If we're not looking at weighted pupil spending, and this would be totally off
It would
the
be all
cuff,
the way down to,
it would be 2.1 or whatever this is billion divided by our just student count, which is around 82,000.
2.5 billion.
I would say 2.1 billion, because that's the total education spending rather than the total uses, divided by 82,000. Or these are all round numbers. If anyone's watching at home,
Yeah.
we're totally going off the cuff here, but it's to make an illustrative point.
82,000. Two.
All he's doing is math. So when the foundation formula said every student's gonna get $15,033, is that doesn't include the additional weighted?
That's per weighted
That's-
student.
Okay,
So that would be comparable to this range, albeit we're changing funding systems. And we're changing pupil weights. But that too is per weighted pupil, right? And I know Ezra's gonna talk about this in a little bit, but that's that 15,000 multiplied by your weighted student count,
Which is
what gets you to your education.
actually right in the middle, right? That's 2 numbers. It's not,
Yeah,
it's not necessarily.
$25,300 a student. But
Catherine Bennett from the Joint Fiscal Office. Julie, what is the total for the long-term weighted count?
141.
So it's 141 students versus 82,000 students. That's what's driving the difference there. And there's valid reasons for looking at both those numbers, and you just need to understand which number you're using and then whenever you're having this conversation.
so we're taking the weighted into that drives the cost down, but really doesn't.
Right, because you're using the 141,000 in these, right?
Drive
Got
the
it.
cost per student down,
Right, but it
not
really
the
is.
total dollars.
Right.
So in theory, if I had known the conversation, we were going to have this conversation, I could have made a second slide that said, the range of per non-weighted pupil spending was, and then take in the education spending divided by the bodies, and that would be getting at the numbers that you're referencing.
Right, it's like, where's that missing
Let's see. It's
$4,000 a student?
so the districts that have more English learners that have higher, do they benefit financially from the foundation formula than the districts that don't have those students?
I would say all else equal, they will receive a higher education opportunity payment. And this gets back to the policy decision and the decision of what is the appropriate level of additional funding to provide to certain students or schools based on circumstance. And that's a policy choice.
So assuming we have the weights right, there's no benefit. Assuming we have the weights right, because that's what it actually costs. And that's a factor of the weights
And
right.
that
But assuming we do. that
goes back
actually-
to, is that weight to have that one student taught by one teacher, or if you have 5 of them, now that cost goes down, but how do you figure that?
So
Sorry to just, before we leave. Maybe we're still on the topic. At some point, I'd just like to throw out there that I went to a listening session in Windsor County with their education leaders. And someone said something like, we're one of the only states that, and it was something like funds social services through the property tax. They were making a more distinct point about sort of where resources come from or how they flow to schools, and that we're kind of an outlier in sort of just lumping it in with mental health needs in schools being they're kind of on their own more than in other states.
well, and all the things we're doing, because all our schools are on what level community schools. Because they try to do all those things, the whole
Yeah,
things together. And there are costs in there that are not, you could argue, not commercially educated, education related.
Right, and I can ask Becca if she remember, or Joe, like if they remember exactly how it was framed.
So
Okay. So I think we have 2 more slides of content. This is the same information that we were just looking at on that little dot graph. Again, this is per weighted pupil spending. So if it were per pupil spending, it would be very different. And we can, if it would be helpful, come back and do that analysis as well. What we're looking at here is literally the same information, just in a different type of graph. This is the histogram. And the way to read it is essentially each one of these bars is showing you within that bin how many districts are sitting in that range. So for instance, there were 4 districts with a per weighted pupil spending below 10,000. 3 districts with a per weighted pupil spending between 10 and 11,000. And then the final slide, this is an update from a few years ago. I wrote a report that was required by Act 127 about cost containment in Vermont, and part of that looked at the student to staff ratio, and the chair asked me to update that. So using the National Center for Education Statistics, I looked into where Vermont sits in comparison to the average, and in comparison to all other states in terms of the student to staff ratio. So the student to staff ratio is essentially what is the average number of students per staff member. This time it's real kids, not weighted kids. And the latest data is from the fall of 2022. So in the fall of 2022, Vermont had the lowest ratio than any other state in the country, meaning that Vermont had fewer students per staff than any other state. This table is capturing that statistic. So I pulled the same states that I had pulled from the report from a few years back, obviously New England states. We can see here is that Vermont in the fall of 2022 had a ratio of about 4.4 students per staff member. So this is not just teachers, but this is all staff associated with education. And that was the lowest ratio in the country.
That's not a good. Because you have like Massachusetts has the best supposed to be school system. Now it's 6.4. Right, it's 13. So less, the lesser the numbers, not always the better.
That can be true. I mean, we are number one in special education delivery in the country. So again, it's worth knowing, like, which I wouldn't be asking JFO to do, but do we have more do we have like double the number of para educators at the next state to us versus like, do we have a high number of administrators who all make a lot of money?
And that's something I can't argue with. What I can't argue with is that we can't afford what we're doing and it's costing our Vermonters. So we gotta find a better balance.
So everything we're looking at, they're all data points. We're just looking at a number of data points here,
Yeah.
For us to keep our minds with a better look.
I did include a link to the tables. If you haven't seen enough numbers today, there's a lot of really cool information and state comparisons available on the National Center for Education Statistics. Worth taking a gander. And that's it. That's everything I prepared.
Very good.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to remind us all of the rising gap, the increasing cost versus for students, and also the revenue and where we have to make up and what the pressure is and why. And so it's all data points, but all things for us to think about as we continue our work.
Great.
So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Ezra. So again, just to remind you, what Ezra's going to do was test something that I put in the bill for us to consider, which was taking the 15,033 and multiplying it times the average increase in spending for the last 2 years. And the number that we first used was a little bit high because we did it at 5.8 to 5.5, I think, initially. That's what we expected, and but the actual number was not 5.5, it was 4.9.
Ezra Holden, Joint Fiscal Office, Chair's referring to the change in education spending from fiscal year 26 to 27, and that was 4.2%. I believe that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we'll talk about
Yeah.
that.
And so the bill has a number, remember, it raises the base as it's written, drafted right now. And we go into that, and this is really to explore what doing that would actually mean, and also whether it actually is the right thing to do. I looked a lot like going through this yesterday, so you will go on the same, on this term now.
Chair, would you like me to share my screen as well?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so we've already gone over this slide, but Joint Fiscal Office, we haven't changed between the two presentations. We're still not partisan, so that's good to know. All right, so as the chair teed up for you, we're going to be talking about some adjustments to the Act 73 base amount per Senate Education's language that the senator was teeing up for you. I will note I do have some overview slides. So some of this looks familiar. That's because it is. I was here, I believe, first week of session, January, talking about this. So some of this is a repeat, and then we'll get to some new content. So just bear with me here. So first, we will just remind ourselves of a few abbreviations that we're going to be seeing on this presentation. So LTW ADM, that stands for long-term weighted average daily membership. So those are your weighted students. And that in a foundation formula is what is driving the funding to a district. We also have some pupil weight abbreviations. So you see FPL, federal poverty level, and so those are your economically disadvantaged students. EL stands for English learner students, students learning English or have English as a second language. And under Act 73, these weights are additive. So if you are FPL and EL, you would add those weights together. So you can have more than one weight as a student. So big picture, when you're thinking about the formula for calculating the amount of money a district would receive for the foundation formula, you would take a base amount and then the weights. So here they're based on student characteristics. You would multiply the long-term weighted membership of taking your students with those characteristics and all students who don't have any weights as well. That's all included in your long-term weighted ADM. And then after you've multiplied those two, your educational opportunity payment, or EOP, is the amount of funding the district will receive. Now, I'll just flag for you, Act 73's foundation formula adds in school support grants. And so that's a little different from the base times LTW ADM, but this is broadly how they work. Yes.
So this is going into this foundational information for the foundation formulas. Is there been any consideration to when a student no longer needs to be considered a English language learner?
But that's not his job.
Okay,
That's
I
a
know.
Policy question.
Right.
Policy,
Let's
that's
say-
for us.
See it drops as they look. On each side you're in.
Yeah, the Act 73 weights for EL students are tiered based on the level of English proficiency. I would say it would probably be it'd be better if the agency or someone from the field came in and testified about how long it takes a student to advance between those levels.
Yeah, I'm not blaming you.
Oh, well, thank you for clarifying.
It is false.
All right, so we're taking a look kind of at foundation formulas as a concept, and now we're just going to get a little more specific with the Act 73 foundation formula. Now, this is as enacted, not considering the chairs or the committee's language. So Act 73 as enacted, that is that 15,033 base amount that I think everyone in this building is pretty familiar with at this point. So that is per long-term ADM if you are a student with no weights, but that's also the same amount that you multiply your long-term weighted amount. So because if you're, again, like we talked about, your long-term weighted ADM are your long-term students plus the weights that those students have, and then that is your long-term weighted ADM multiplied by this base amount. So just to remind everyone.
So it has been raised in various forums that there is a request out there for the consulting group. Can we hire that consulting group?
Yes.
Stearns.
It's Stearns
The
for the foundation work.
Oh, no.
So, Act 73 Joint Fiscal Office contracted with the American Institute for Research, or AIR. For
Okay,
Act 73, is that
maybe,
okay?
probably.
Okay.
One of the charges is the foundation formula weights and calculation. And is it not?
Catherine Benson, the fiscal officer. So you're talking, yes, the answer is we got a study underway right now. Also.
Okay.
Is that what you're talking about? There was
Yeah.
a study that was done and then we are continuing
Yeah.
to do some more work.
What I had heard that I'd like to confirm or deny is that a request exists, has passed some committee to add cost of living to their study work or adjustments to the formula for certain districts for cost of living And I wanted to ask either now or for the future, if that exists in other states, if that's something that's under consideration and it's a meaningful calculation that can be made. Granted, I think it's really challenging when people live in different counties that commute to work and we're a small state, but I don't know what, I'd like to be up to speed on if that has made it into some formal request.
Do you want to answer? You want me to answer?
And
So-
if it's informal, you can say no, but if it's formal.
So I don't recall that the original scope of work had cost of living. I don't think that was in Act 73. If there are any additional conversations, I don't think I would be able
I
to.
do know about it. So AIR does have some information, and it's something that they always look at
Okay.
when they do this work.
Uh-huh.
How it will play out in Vermont, I can't speak to that yet because they're still doing the work, but they have, especially as we get to bigger states,
Mhm.
have even more disparate
Yeah.
economies, that is a part of it. So it's something that they know about and think about, and I don't want to speak yet to how
Okay.
how it will get used in this study or not, because I don't know the answer.
Okay. Do either of you know, or maybe the NEA knows, because I'm sure it matters to them. Is the House bill contemplating anything about cost of living differential?
So I don't know that.
Okay, so that's like a legislative council question, and that is in the bill. I just wanted to sort of, before I go responding to anyone, it's in the bill that may make it to the floor.
Would you like me to answer?
Sure.
Colorado's running. It asked JFO to study it.
Okay,
I think that's how it is.
okay. And it came out of, do we know it's that bill made out of Ways and Means? It's in Ways and Means.
Right now.
And it came in Ways and Means, or it was in the House Education proposal? Okay, thank you. Sorry to pepper you with questions.
Are you?
It's good. So 15033.
Yeah, so 15033, that's the base amount we're talking about in Act 73 as enacted. I will note that this is from fiscal year 2025. The foundation formula does not go into effect until fiscal year 2029. And so this amount in Act 73 is inflated by NIPA to when it actually comes into effect. The language that Senate Education has been discussing is effectively inflating this 15033 by a different inflator for 2 years and then switching back to the NIPA inflator. I would just say the table is here if you all want to peruse the different weights, but just overall, this is from big picture. These are the weights from the Doctors Colby and Baker memo from April of last year. I will note that the special education census block grant that we use in current law is replaced by tiered weights that are on the table. And also small school and sparsity are weights in the current system. Under Act 73, those are support grants. So those are just the big things I would flag. And we can just take a look actually at those small and sparse school grants. So under Act 73 as enacted, if a school is considered a small school or a sparse school as defined in Act 73, they're eligible for an additional support grant. So to receive a small school support grant, Act 73 says you need to have an average enrollment over 2 years of fewer than 100 pupils, and you need to be considered small by necessity. And that's currently undefined. Sparse school, it's similar. It's a 2-part test. So to be considered eligible for your sparse school support grant, you need to be a school located in a city, town, or village with a population of fewer than 55 people per square mile. And again, there is a by necessity test. Here it is sparse by necessity, which is also undefined. And if you are eligible for one or both of those grants, you would multiply your 2-year average enrollment by the grant amount, which is detailed in this table here. Again, these are fiscal year 2025 amounts. So that's about a little over $3,100 for a small school support grant per average student, and then about $1,950 per pupil for a sparse school support grant.
And are these amounts multiplied by the index as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. These would be increased by NIPA. They're not linked to the base. So by changing the base as in the sentence language, and this is something we talked about, these don't change. Their inflation metric doesn't change. They're going to stay with NIPA because it's not a function of the base.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have an area that has both?
But I don't think,
That is sparse?
yeah, I think you can. Yeah.
And so that's additional per pupil. So you could have another additional $5,000 per
Yeah.
pupil.
Yeah. That'd be very low for that. But,
Yeah.
Or likely very low.
I will just note that this is per 2-year enrollment, so that's not weighted pupils. So the weights do not impact how much a school receives. So if your average enrollment, once in seats, that's what we're talking about.
Let's see. So
Right, this is about
Yeah.
seats, not weighted. Right?
Exactly. So, taking a small step forward, Act 73, the dollar amount was for fiscal year 2025. But if we think about if Act 73 were implemented in fiscal year 2026, we can take a look at how 1 year of inflation would change some of those dollar amounts. I think this is helpful because the Senate's language is contemplating fiscal year 2027. So I think this is one step at a time to kind of move us there instead of jumping from 2025 to 2027. I think another piece of information that's helpful here is noting that if you see some handouts from House Education that we were asked to do, JFO was asked to do, that's using fiscal year 2026 by NIPA amount. So if you do see that handout, this gives you a little bit of context of where those amounts come from. So if we implemented Act 73, if the legislature implemented Act 73 in fiscal year 2026, after accounting for the change in NIPA, which I didn't have that footnote earlier, it's the National Income and Product accounts. They're at the bottom of the full list price later description. It's a little bit of a mouthful. So that's there. So that would give you a base amount of about 15,456 per your long-term weighted ADM. And so you can think about you started 15,033 after 1 year of using this price deflator, you're now at that 15,456. Just to remind everyone, pupil weights are not adjusted by inflation. Pupil weights are multiplied against your base amount. So the base is changing, not the weight. So if a student is an EL student, the weight doesn't change, but the base of that student is what's changing. Here, just to clarify that. And so since we're increasing that base amount, that affects all district weighted student counts. As the base increases, all else equal, the district's EOP, the funding that they would receive under this is increasing this concept. The school support grants are at the bottom, have increased by NIPA as well. So again, not adjusted by any weights or anything. So that's just the butts and seats 2-year enrollment.
And this is a 1 year. This is 1 year of the thing. Okay.
Yeah, and if you just kind of want to riff your slides back and forth, you can kind of see the 1 year shift between those grants, if that's of interest. And so now we'll take a look at Senate education concept, which the chair laid out for the committee. So thinking about fiscal year 2027 here, the Senate education's bill would inflate the Act 73 base amount by the actual change in education spending from fiscal year 2025 to fiscal year 2027. And so after fiscal year 2027, which is when you would take the base amount that's outlined in the language, that new base amount would be increased going forward using NIPA, which is the same as in Act 73. So really, the adjustment is just happening to the first 2 years, and then the same inflator as originally envisioned takes over. I've said this before, just want to hit again, school support grants are not affected by this concept because they are not linked to a base. You would need, if one wanted to change that, you would need additional language that changed the, whatever inflation metric you're using for that, because it's not linked to the base, so it's not an automatic change. So to put some numbers up, I believe the chair had warned for the committee, I think it was last week, that you would see a different base amount. As the chair is teeing up, the original base amount in the language was using a projection from the December 1 letter of change in education spending. Now that we have received the majority of school budgets, we've actually adjusted that number, and the actual change was a little bit lower. So that's why this base amount is lower than, I can't remember off the top of my head, whatever,
80 something, I forgot whatever. Yeah.
So this is based on changes of about 5.8 and about 4.2% in fiscal years 2026 and 2027 respectively. There's some extra decimals, but to make it easier, if we just rounded that up.
Quick question, the per pupil spending that we have in fiscal year 2026, I know that the range is between almost 11,000 and 19,000. Are you able to tell us just what the average is across the state for all students per pupil spending?
So I would have to come back with that. I don't off the top of my head. And I guess kind of what Julie was speaking to earlier, we would just want to know what we're counting, weighted students or unweighted students, and then all education uses or just the education spending. So is there a particular?
I guess unweighted, I'm really what I'm trying to get at is to figure out with the foundation formula, how it would compare without the added weights compared to the per pupil spending with the system that we have now. Is that making sense?
So we could do something like that. I guess I would just caution that since weights are part of the current system, even if you do back out and just say on the average from unweighted students, since weights do exist, it's influencing behavior on the ground since districts are creating their own budget. So I guess I would flag that, but we can.
I mean, if weighted
I
makes
can have,
sense, then I wasn't sure if that would add a lot more challenge to that.
so yeah, we can come back with something.
Okay.
Catherine Bevan, Joint Fiscal, tell me again the question you're trying to
Yeah,
answer.
I'm trying to figure out. I'm really just trying to compare the foundation formula to the system that we have now. And I'll say with the weights, the average amount that we would be spending per pupil in the foundation formula compared to the system that we have now.
Okay, and Act 73 is it passed?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we have, if you're just over like the total spend across the state, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good.
Yeah,
place to
we can, we'll work, I'll talk to you later. I've got some thoughts on it. We can get him something.
Yeah, and actually hearing you lay out the question again to Catherine, I think you would probably want to do the comparison by weighted students, that range that Julia was talking about, rather than unweighted students, because this is the amount that would be multiplied against the long-term weighted ADM. So I think we would want to probably think about doing a weighted average.
Yeah.
or weighted.
That makes more sense then. Definitely.
The ed team will talk, and then we'll get back to you if that's okay.
Why don't we do that? We'll talk.
Thank you.
And you're looking at you want to know sort of what the total statewide spend under foundation versus under this?
Yes.
Okay.
Not per pupil or?
Sorry, yes, per pupil.
No,
I'm getting at,
okay,
but statewide.
Okay, I see.
The
Statewide.
average statewide number. So we'll come up with the total spend and we'll divide it by the number. We can show you the total spend.
Okay, I'm also happy to talk offline and
Yeah.
just to
So
share.
why don't we do that?
Okay, That's-
You're thinking about, to the extent that the foundation formula is less money, how much less or more?
Yeah,
What it
yeah,
is,
yeah.
how it-
Yeah, I guess, are we spending more or less or the same?
That'd be about the same and hoping that it'll eventually bridge it.
Okay. Okay, got it, right, okay.
Yeah, we'll definitely, we'll circle back with Senator. Thanks. So during the same time frame, and actually, let me just, so the 16,575 to just get back to where we were, that's increasing by these two the actual change over fiscal years 2026 and 2027.
So it's 15,033 times 5.8, then times 4.2.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's approximately, yeah.
That's either 16,575.
Yeah, so the cumulative change, after accounting for a little bit of compounding, would be a little over 10% change there. During the same time frame, the NIPA increase would be about 6%. And so if you use NIPA for that same time period, the base would be 15,936 in fiscal year 2027. So in terms of comparison of the Senate Ed language to Act 73, I think those would be the two numbers. If that was the comparison you were trying to make, is that 16,575 from the Senate's language. Without the Senate's language, it would be approximately 15,936. So this would be higher than Act 73 as an act.
It's been $600 higher.
I do have a summary table that we'll get to, and then the sparse and small school grants don't change by this concept. So what you see for fiscal year 27, you would get under Act 73 without any further changes, because that's again just update by NIPA.
So let me just refresh people what I was thinking about this and why I did this exercise. Was thinking that if we used just the NIPA off the 15033, when the foundation formula came into effect, we would have a cliff. This is the cliff, such as it is, because it's the difference between, or at least perhaps between the 16,575 and the 15, almost 16 would be getting. So, and now there's other reasons we're going to see why that's not exactly accurate, because it's a lot more complicated than I thought it was the more we get into this. But
It's always more complicated.
what it was that what I was worried about or thinking about was when it goes into effect, we're going to have to flip. That's why I wanted to experiment with this, just to refresh numbers. So go on.
All right, so I think this is a nice summary table to kind of just put everything in the last slide into more visually palatable form. So overall, Senate education proposal would lead to a higher base amount. All else equal, this would result in school districts receiving a larger EOP, which again, that is the funding that you would receive under foundation formula. However, again, all else equal, this would require an increased property taxes compared to Act 73 because the amount of funding overall is higher. That's holding everything constant, not accounting for any of those non-property revenues that Julia talked about or any other changes in student counts or anything else, but trying to keep it a little apples to apples. And so you can see here in this first of the three boxes, Act 73 as enacted, the change between fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 2027 is about 6% and a little over $900 between the two. The center box is the Senate education proposal. So that cumulative inflator would be about 10.3% over the same time frame. And so you can see the difference there is about a little over $1,500 versus fiscal year 2025, leading to that third box, which is the dollar and relative percentage difference between the Senate education space and Act 73 as enacted space, which is the roughly $600 that the chair was referring to, which is about 4%. All right, and this is my last content slide. I don't have a slide, I think, talking about the complications that the chair laid out, but I'm happy to try and paint a picture without the slide. But this graph is just trying to highlight that using a different inflator for the first 2 years of the foundation formula's inflating period, it's not in effect, but it is growing by this inflator kind of in the background before it comes into effect. So using that would lead to a higher foundation formula base compared to Act 73. And this graph illustrates that after doing that for 2 years, you've permanently altered the trajectory if nothing else has changed. So you can see the green line is the Senate education and concepts. And the blue line is the Act 73 NIPA only inflation. So you can see that the line is rising. They're both starting at 15,033, but you can see that because the Senate education inflator is higher, that line is rising more sharply than the blue one. And then you can see in FY27, it breaks a little bit and becomes linear with the blue line. I will note that while they remain the same trajectory because of the percentage, the dollar gap between the two will continue to grow, as Julia nicely teed up in her presentation. If the base amount that you're applying your percentage multiplier against is higher, that dollar amount will be higher. So the trajectory though is the same, but the higher dollar amount, and that won't change if this is done. And this, I will note that this is estimating out to fiscal year 2030, and that's using estimates provided to us by the state's legislative economists. And so if anything were to change in any of these future fiscal years, this picture would look a little different because they are estimating out several fiscal years. So just want to highlight that. This is not JFO's estimate right here. So
Post 27, you're using just the projected inflation.
So even for fiscal year 2027, it's still preliminary because right now we're in fiscal year 2026. So I think, yeah, you have, I think everything outside of fiscal year 26 is probably a preliminary estimate. And the further out you get, the more preliminary that estimate would be. And vice versa, I'd say the closer you are, your estimate gets a little bit more solid because there are fewer years for things to change. And I just have a few data considerations. Again, like I just talked about, we have some state economist estimates in there for future fiscal years, so that could change, and that would change this analysis. JFO modeling for the chair's proposal, the Senate committee's proposal, uses fiscal year 2027 spending as of March 20th. Most of the budgets are in, but there are a few that have not been finalized, so there could be tweaks around the edges, but I wouldn't expect anything dramatic since we do have the majority of school budgets in. And the Sparks and Small School grants, just want to keep reiterating this, that does not change under this language. It's still NIPA. Just want to reiterate that. And that is all I have for content slides. Chair, if you would like me to try and speak to a little bit of the difficulty you were talking about, or if you want to just leave it at that, we can leave it at that.
Well, we started so at this point yesterday, we started the discussion. I took out my calculator and took the $632 difference in FY27 that it would be, and just multiplied times 82, what did it do to 142? And I think I came up with 51 million or something like that. And then that doesn't account for the variance in the weights. So I was trying to just do what's this actually going to cost, and that led to a more complicated discussion than me taking out my calculator.
Doesn't change my life.
So, and I think to the chair's point about thinking about just like, the 142, I think it's wise to not necessarily try and take that and overlay that weighted pupil count to this because the weights are changing. So I wouldn't automatically assume 142,000 students.
82.
Yeah, but yeah, just adding context to why I think that would be a wise to not try and overlay the 142,000 over here because there are changing weights. So yeah, just to add context.
And then we talked about the fact that depending on the study, the weighting study, things could change. Like for instance, if we added in the 10% high school weight or 12% high school weight, something similar to what we're actually spending on high schools now, then that number would go up by a lot more, and maybe the base would be that I was sort of proposing to look at would be overly inflated. Because in some ways, if you didn't count under being the high school weight, but that's just one example, and there's other aspects of this. So it finally led me to think probably should wait until we know all of that before we try to figure out what the right, but I don't know. So I've come, there's a part of me that wants to raise the base because I think it will help smooth the transition.
Right.
And but there's always calculations for us to make, but so I sort of, at the very least, realized that it's more complex.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's a certain degree to which I think I'm right at why I say I might. If there were no weights, if we were looking at weights, there would be that kind of that 4% cliff.
Mm-hmm.
But then what the weights do to that in the end will affect how real that cliff is.
So just to add a little more context to what the chair's saying, just
In other words, it's more complicated than
Yeah.
I said. Yeah.
well, I would just want to clarify that the 4% cliff is only if you're thinking about these two bases here and not a statewide impact. So I just would want to clarify that this is not trying to say that there's 4% difference between current spending and Act 73. Just to clarify right here, that 4% is looking at the difference between these two inflation benefits.
Yes.
Yeah, just to clarify that. I know we had talked about that yesterday.
And the reason I think of that as a cliff is because the numbers that we used to come up with the Senate calculation are real.
Mhm.
They have the actual increases in spending for the last few years.
Yeah, sure. That's where the difference in the inflation method comes, just to flag that there are outstanding policy decisions in relation to Act 73 that could make that different. Since like career and technical education, we discussed this yesterday.
But go ahead, pull it apart for this committee here. That's what I wanted you to do today.
So a good example of this is career and technical education. If it's up to the legislature to make decisions around that to determine, is it in the base or is it not in the base? If the legislature says that that the base needs to cover career and technical education, then you can say, well, CTE is there, it's in the base, it's in Act 73. If the legislature came back after receiving additional information or additional policies and said, no, we need X, whether X is a categorical A, is a weight, or a different decision, then suddenly CTE is not within Act 73's base anymore. So that's just an example of an outstanding policy decision that would change the whole cliff, or not a cliff. That's just flagging one example.
Senator.
Yeah, I'm thinking, maybe we're thinking too far out in front because like my districts, I've got districts that the average student payment is like $11,000. They're gonna get that much more money. There's gonna have to be an adjustment period anyway. Some schools aren't gonna think they get enough money, and some are gonna say, well, what am I gonna do with all this stuff? If we give it to them, they're gonna spend it, right?
Yeah.
So is there a mechanism for any surplus that they don't use? I think
That's
it
it.
is. Didn't it go into the construction?
No, they can they can reserve it, they can put it in reserves and they use it for instance, construction or maintenance or other things. It's, they get X and they can kind of spend it how they want to.
Cause I keep telling my superintendents, you know what? You had to drop your per pupil spending to, in some cases, to get your budget sense. What did you cut out?
Yeah.
You know, what did you take?
Yeah.
What are you doing without?
Yeah.
Now they can put that back in.
Yeah.
The pension, so.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. So, yeah. And I was thinking about also just this is sort of trying to do a little bit of extra protection for the smoothing out the high spending districts to be able to come into this formula. But all of those factors are there and all the complications came out through this analysis.
Was that taken into consideration when they came up with the $15,033 to try to smooth it out for the higher spending districts? You know?
So I can't speak to the methodology that went into the cost factor formula. That was done by Drs. Colby and Baker in the memo reference there. I will note that there is in Act 73 a transition period where they take essentially the difference between what you spent in current law and what you would receive under the foundation formula. There's an adjustment period that would step you up into or step you down into. So perhaps that's what you're thinking of, Senator, and that is built into Act 73.
So 5 years, I forgot.
I can't, on the top of my head, I
we
can't
had 5
remember.
years in this bill, in our bill, in a year, but you're not in guess, it's 5 years, yeah. So yeah, that's how, so, okay. So, we can just, we have this now, we've gone through this. The lesson for me, the combination of all this, is just that reminder about the rate of increase we're seeing in spending. The factor driving it and the fact that we've got a gap widening and again, that we can't go on. That widening gap, it's not sustainable. Just reiterating that on the one hand, then, but also looking at this specific proposal that I wanted to just put in there for us to explore, and we've now done that. So, thank you. That was actually really
Thank you.
yeah.
Both are very well done.
Both were really
Very well done.
well. Thank you. We have not anything until 3:15. Anything? Anybody wants to?
Just a quick comment because of learning more about the weighted pupil and that. It's that, you know, once you break it down, an additional 61,564 students, if you will, on 83,000.
Yeah.
So it averages out to 1.32 for the weighted per pupil. So let's take a school in Chittenden County that may have a bunch of English learners that they need. And is there a mechanism that we have in there, because they could get, their weights could be really, really high, especially if they're English learners. Is there any calculation we can build in there that once you have, say Spanish, you have 10 Spanish students who are going to learn English, so they're going to, most of them are, but even if you break it into 2 classes, 5, we should have a way to calculate now that school doesn't need, we still need, but it shouldn't be, so let's say it's 2.5, it should lessen down to, because there's a lot of cost savings there that could be for the state.
So, yeah, I don't, we haven't gotten into that, but generally speaking, I've been trying for us.
I know we're doing 30,000.
Well, we passed the foundation formula passed last year.
Yeah.
And our job was to come up with fix the trigger make the trigger mechanism happen. So I've kind of largely left it at that. Even tinkering with the base that we did was a little bit out of our lane way I see it, but I wanted to, but so I don't know the answer to that. I know what you're saying. You're saying it should get more efficient because there's more.
Right, it's different if you had one student and, okay, that makes sense. And I'm pretty sure that's probably how they based it when they did the formula, that I have this one student that has this need, this is what it's gonna cost, but now I have 5 or 6. There's money to be, money to be saved by the school to use even else, and I'm sure that's what the schools do, use it elsewhere in their budget if they can.
Yeah, I will tell you that my way, I've been thinking about all of this as a staff for a long time before the financial plans, and if we'll have time to take over all that stuff. I've been just trying to really focus on getting the map right, fewer districts, fewer CSU. Yeah, it's not that, that's a legitimate question that you're asking.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so we're off to 3:15. Then we had one more witness kind of budget discussion. So does everybody have their letter with them, their draft of? Remember, bring this. I said that last time.
Bring it.